This RC helicopter is the Blade Eclipse 360, an RC helicopter marketed toward beginners, but can offer some exciting experiences for intermediate and advanced helicopter pilots alike. The scale aesthetic is complemented by the ability to perform some light 3D aerobatics, and the traditional helicopter frame is actually covered by this foam exterior, which gives it a nice sleek aesthetic. It comes in this silver paint scheme, but there's also a Coast Guard helicopter livery as well. I haven't had a helicopter in my RC hangar for over 10 years, so this is the first new to me and new to my lineup that I've kind of been getting back into rotorcraft with. I have quite the assortment of fixed-wing aircraft, so as far as helicopters go, this was sort of the introductory for me back into the modern day helicopter selection, and this aircraft is actually enabled with safe select and a gyroscope, so that stability and flight for a beginner is pretty achievable, but it also offers that exciting 3D performance through the stunt modes as well. So far, my experiences with this helicopter have been excellent. I would not call myself a beginner pilot by any means, but certainly a novice or potentially an intermediate pilot. I felt that the initial setup and getting this thing in the air was extremely achievable, with the exception of one slight issue. I was able to get it in the air pretty quickly on the maiden and fly it around. So that caveat is actually why I've created this video. I wanted to quickly recap one issue I discovered with this helicopter so that anybody who's buying this or maybe having issues with flight performance can get that dialed in and get this in the air. Stick around and we'll talk about the issue that I found out. Stay tuned. So just like with the rest of the aircraft in my hangar, I have configured and am currently flying the Eclipse 360 on this RadioMaster TX16S Mark II. I have quite a few planes and now a helicopter from Horizon Hobby E-Flight that utilize the DSM protocol, but I also have a selection of other planes and receivers on the market that the benefit of using this transmitter is that it communicates with multiple different protocols, which makes it great if you don't just have one ecosystem of aircraft. I'm pretty familiar with the ecosystem and the operating system of this remote, so setup was rather straightforward. I created a profile for the helicopter and was able to get it dialed in, and thankfully the receiver and the flight controller on the helicopter do have telemetry enabled, so I was able to get into the programming of those and ultimately helped me to overcome the issue that I wanted to talk about on this video. So as is pretty common across gyro-enabled RC helicopters, there are multiple flight modes that can be configured on the Blade Eclipse 360. First of which is normal mode, which is actually where the safe feature is enabled, and that will prevent you from overbanking or flipping the aircraft over in any way. So there are limitations to how far you can bank or pitch so that you don't end up in a predicament of the aircraft being in an orientation that you can't control. So this mode definitely targets beginners who aren't quite ready to move into that 3D flight envelope yet. And this is actually the flight mode that you will see featured in the maiden flight video on my channel, just kind of getting a feel for the aircraft and getting it dialed in. That is the flight mode that I initially flew the aircraft in. So on collective pitch helicopters, there's a mechanical element called the Swashplate, which is where all of the servo linkages connect, and that's ultimately how the pitch and the angle of the blades are manipulated in order to control the direction of flight. So when I initially unboxed my helicopter and got it hooked up to my remote and had it in the normal safe mode, I noticed the swash plate was at a rather irregular angle relative to a neutral level position. I do know that sometimes the helicopters can have a slight angle to them in order to counter the torque and the rotation of the rotors. However, it seemed like a bit of an excessive angle. However, I took it out in the field and wanted to see what would happen if I tried to spool it up, and here's the result. So as you can see, as soon as the wheels started to get off the ground, the helicopter actually tipped over and caused both props to strike on the ground. Thankfully, I was able to shut it down and recover. So my intuition, unfortunately, was correct in that that angle seemed to be a bit aggressive and more than would be necessary to counter the torque. So I took it back to the bench and dug into the manual a little bit and some of the forward programming options to see what could be causing this issue. I I actually stumbled across another video from many years ago addressing a similar problem on another helicopter, a Blade helicopter specifically. So I decided to kind of synthesize some of the information from that video as well as what the manual stated to see if I could correct the problem in the forward programming. There was a gyroscope calibration process in the manual that didn't unfortunately fix this problem. There's also a trim flight setting that will allow you to get the aircraft airborne and trim it out, and that will automatically set calibration values for the aircraft trim. However, it requires you to get the helicopter in the air, which I was unfortunately able to do. However, I kind of deduced that the output of that trim flight process would be calibration of the attitude trim settings within forward programming. So if we jump into the remote right now, I can show you where those settings are and ultimately how I had to manipulate those values to level the Swashplate and enable me to take off and have a successful maiden flight. So let's jump into the transmitter really quick. And just as a reminder, this is a RadioMaster TX16 running EdgeTX, so the screen will look a little bit different than if you're using a Spectrum transmitter, but overall the options in the settings menu should be very similar and you should be able to achieve a similar result. So with the aircraft powered on and connected to your remote, we're gonna head over into the software here. This is running EdgeTX, as I mentioned, on my RadioMaster. However, if you're running a standard Spectrum remote, you would just enter the menus appropriately, but for the purposes of EdgeTX, we'll head over to System, and you need to have the DSM tools package installed. We'll go to forward programming, and I've already configured the aircraft to be compatible with these modes. So once there, we're actually gonna head down to Safe and Attitude Trim. You'll see both of these are zeroed out, which is how I've achieved stable takeoff and flight since the video that I showcased of the initial takeoff and unsuccessfully. But if we go in here and select the roll option and click the default button, we'll notice that there was a change in the pitch of the prop in the background actually. And if we go hit OK, we'll see that switches back to the factory default option of 450, which if we take a look here at the Swashplate, you can kind of see there is a bit of a tilt, which would cause the aircraft to bank to the right, and ultimately is what we saw exhibited in the video. So for some reason, out of the box, we're seeing that be a 450 value, which unfortunately caused the takeoff behavior that we saw. So ultimately, I had to come in here and zero out this 450 value. And as we do that, we can slowly see the blades starting to move back to a neutral position in the background. All right, so we are down to 0. We'll hit OK to make sure that saves. They both are 0, in fact. So ultimately, you can see that the Swashplate is much more level and has enabled me to take off successfully from this point on. There is a slight tilt to the right, but as I mentioned earlier in the video, it's a bit of a torque compensation. As the blades spin in that clockwise position, it will enable the helicopter to maintain its position in the air and not move too much around that torque axis. So I'm not sure overall if this is a programming element specific to this flight controller or if other Blade helicopters will experience this out of the box, but modifying these out-of-box safe settings certainly enables me to fly the helicopter with no issues. I've noticed no adverse flight conditions or anything, so I think this is the right course of action to ultimately remedy this problem. So I did include some flight footage of my first successful takeoff after changing these settings, and here it is. So as you can see from my second flight video, takeoff was nominal, no issues, and ultimately changing those configurations manually from what their set default values were was the right move and ultimately allowed me to fly this helicopter successfully. So not sure why the values were so extreme out of the box. Hopefully if you have a new Blade helicopter, an Eclipse 360 or otherwise, and you notice this tendency before you take off on your maiden, you can avoid the prop strike like I experienced and potentially further damage. So hopefully you found this information helpful. If you do have a new helicopter and you have questions or want to talk about the configuration, drop a comment down below. But I appreciate you watching. Feel free to subscribe and like the video. Stay tuned for more videos about the Eclipse 360 and the other fixed wing aircraft or new rotors that I add to my hangar. Thanks for watching, and we'll catch you in the next one.